Alright, we're going to do a quick timeline of the history of Islam, covering almost exactly 1400 years. So we're only going to hit the high points, obviously, or else we'd be here for a long time. So we start in 610. This is when Muhammad received his first revelation that went into the Quran. He was dead by 632, and a lot happened in those 22 years. This is not represented here, but he was forced to flee to Medina. His ideas were unpopular with a lot of people in Mecca, which is where he received the revelations. But by 630, he was able to come back and reconquer, or to conquer Mecca in a military victory. So in between, in these 102 years, a lot more happened. So in the exact 100 years between Muhammad's death in 632 and the Battle of Tours in 732, Muslims conquered a huge amount of territory, from all of the Arabian Peninsula into even as far east as Afghanistan, into northern Africa, and up even into Spain. Now, the significance of the Battle of Tours, which is in southern France, is that that is what stopped the Muslim expansion into Europe. The French, under Charles Martel, won a victory over Muslim forces at the Battle of Tours in 732. If that hadn't happened, history could have gone very, very differently, because that stopped the expansion of Islam into Europe. Europe remained Christian for as long as it remained Christian. But 732 is when the spread of Islam in terms of military conquest stopped. In 1291, Muslims expulsed the Crusaders from Israel. That was another big military victory. It was in the 11th century that Christian Crusaders conquered Jerusalem, and it was a few hundred years later when the Muslims expulsed them. In 1453, Muslims captured Constantinople. This is really important because Constantinople was, since for over 1,000 years, the capital of the Roman Empire, which by this point was long out of existence, but was still the center of Christendom in some respects. 1492 to 1498 was a very important time. 1492, two huge things happened. The one we're most familiar with is the sailing of Columbus to America. The one we're less familiar with is that this is when Muslims were expulsed from Spain. They were kicked out, along with Jews. So before this, they had lived in Spain. A lot of people view this as a very fruitful time of kind of tolerance and interaction among Christians, Jews, and Muslims. But in 1492, they were kicked out of Spain. Now, the importance of Columbus in 1492 and the importance in 1498 of Vasco da Gama sailing from Portugal around the tip of Africa, between Africa and Madagascar up into India, is that both of these two things represented new trade routes by sea. So before the 1490s, most of the trade routes from Europe to India, for example, went through Muslim territory. After the 1490s, especially after Vasco da Gama's sailing around Europe to India, there was a new trade route, an easier trade route, and it became the trade route that trade took to and from India from Europe, and it was by sea. Now, the importance of that is that Muslims were no longer interacting with Europeans along that trade route. They had less power, politically speaking, because they did not control the main trade route from India to Europe. Okay, now we're going to fast forward a lot here to what's called the Arab Spring in 2011. The Arab Spring was a movement across several countries in the Arabian Peninsula, primarily, but also in northern Africa, like Egypt, in which more dictatorial governments were toppled in favor of more democratic governments. And in 2011, people in the West were very optimistic that this meant a large-scale democratic movement in the Middle East and North Africa. It turns out a few years later there was a reaction against it from conservative groups in those places, in which a more theocratic government took back control.